heard Flens today use castor in conversation. Prognastia? What do you call it?
Prosopagnosia. See, you don't have it. This is why you don't have any need to know it.
You showed me one of the first online quizzes I ever took.
Was it for that?
Long, long, long ago. And it was Harvard's study of whether or not you have this. And boy, is it challenging because it is drawings of people's faces, all of them without hair.
And so they show you this picture of the person, but it's a realistic drawing, sort of photorealistic, but totally hairless. And then they show you this. You look at it for 5 seconds, and then they show you 4 or 5 faces.
Many different faces.
Yeah, many different. One of which is the face you just saw, and can you pick it out? And
it's hard.
Yeah, it's very hard.
And it gets harder. It's different sections of the quiz, and you take it with increasing despair.
I took it with immediate despair and went down to suicidal. I tried to cheat, actually, because I was doing so badly.
Tell the story of when your brother would come to pick you up in elementary school.
Oh, this was awful. Yes, I quite frequently failed to recognize her. This always hurt my mother's feelings for some reason.
Strange reason.
I mean,
that is a really great story, though.
I don't think it was actually as often as I remember, but I don't think it had to happen very many times.
No, not for a mom.
Not for a mom.
Now, what would you like me to say in my introduction? What books?
I'll just say this is Wizard and the Prophet and several other books.
I'm going to grab a seat. So
okay.
You guys can start when you're ready.
All right. Should I walk up beside you or sit down and come up? What would make you feel better?
I think I'm supposed to do it alone.
Okay. Then.
Now, what do you want me to say? What books do you want me to plug?
Just mention The Wizard and the Prophet.
What?
Just say The Wizard and the Prophet in 1491 and 1493 if you want to.
Well, of course I want to.
Okay.
What about the Aspirin Wars?
No, that's enough. That's enough. People won't remember. I'm wondering, though, is there a way that the lights can be turned down and when,
Yeah, let me ask you.
Mm-hmm. How much? It's now 12:17. If that clock is accurate.
Sorry?
That's.
Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Friedman seminar, and we'll soon have a live mic. Do we have a live mic? No. Now we have. We don't have a live mic yet.
No, the big one.
The big one. Well, there doesn't seem to be a switch for it. It's going to be important for the speaker, not me. So this doesn't matter at all.
He's got a lab on. He's fine.
Oh, you've got a lab.
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll just shout. That's
right,
fine. I'm Corby Kummer, senior lecturer here. I'm lucky enough to be a new faculty member, and we are even luckier to have Charles Mann come talk about his new book, The Wizard and the Prophet. Charles Mann has been writing for The Atlantic since 1989? Earlier. 1984. 1984. And I have been lucky enough to edit him for that long. And you have to please look at his entire archive on The Atlantic because the range of his subject matter and expertise is extraordinary, including a book that we ran an excerpt of called The Aspirin Wars, about the thrilling and strife-filled history of the discovery of aspirin and marketing of it as a drug, in which you learn scary things about acetaminophen that will change your drug-taking, and ibuprofen that will change your drug-taking habits starting today. But if you look at the current issue of The Atlantic online, you will find an excerpt from Charles's new book in which he talks a great deal about the founding of the Green Revolution, the enormous contributions it made to mankind and the world's population, and the concurrent founding of the environmental movement. It's a history that wasn't known until Charles really happened on the simultaneity of it, which he called, you have a more felicitous phrase than God's gift to a freelance writer, but it was a wonderful gift to be able to write about the simultaneous development of these two movements. I get to teach writing here, and there's really no better way to learn to write than to read Charles Mann. So if you read his best-selling books, 1491 and 1493, as I suspect many of you have already, if you go back to it, you'll find lessons in how to introduce complex scientific topics, weave it gracefully with scientific history, keep people up to date about the latest discoveries in new fields of research, and do it all with immense ease, competence, skill, and grace, which is the hallmark of a Charles Mann article and book. So we're very lucky to have Charles with us today, and thank you all for coming.
Do I switch this on? Am I on? You can hear me? Because I actually don't know. In the back, can you hear? Okay, great. That was a thumbs up, right? You weren't giving me the middle finger. And you can see this and it's in focus? Yep. Okay. So a few years ago, I finally got around to reading Al Gore's book about climate change. And I live in Amherst in the western part of the state, and I was sitting in a cafe reading the book, and there was a tap on my shoulder, and it was this woman here, one of my neighbors. Her name is Lynn Margulis. She passed away a few years ago, but she was one of America's foremost biologists. She was a microbiologist, won every award you can possibly imagine, and she snatched the book from my hand and started flipping through it, and came across a picture of, I believe, an endangered polar bear, which she kind of sneered at and handed it back to me, the book. And so I said, what? In the way you might. And she said, you know, mammals. And I actually knew what she meant. She's a microbiologist, which means she specializes in the world of bacteria and fungi and protists and algae and so on. And so she knew that that's 99% of the world's biomass, 99% of the world's evolutionary creativity, and that we mammals, from her point of view, we were cute, but not actually important. And so she sort of handed this back to me, and I said, stupidly, trying to stick up for us mammals, I said, well, don't you think it would be sad if we wiped ourselves out with climate change or something like that? And she looked at me pityingly, and she said this, look, it's the fate of every successful species to wipe yourself out. And I was not taken aback, because the odd thing is, I knew what she meant. And she was talking about the second Copernican revolution. Now, the first Copernican revolution you probably learned about in school, and that's this guy here, Nicholas Copernicus, and what he did was decenter us physically. He said the Earth is not a special place in the center of the universe with its own special laws. It's just a dot among many other dots, all of which are fundamentally similar, and all of which are governed by the same laws. The second Copernican revolution is this guy, Charles Darwin. And what he says is there's these overarching natural laws, biological processes that govern all of life. People are not special. We're not the center of the universe with our own special biological laws and our own special processes. The same rules apply to us. We're just a dot on the tree of life, along with every other dot, all of which are governed by the same physical processes and rules. And one of the rules is shown here. Put two bacteria into a petri dish where they seem to have unlimited resources, and they'll eat and multiply and eat and multiply and eat and multiply and eat and multiply until they hit the edge of the petri dish, at which point they'll either run out of resources or drown in their own wastes, or both. And that's the rules. That's biology. And she thought, you're kidding yourself if you think anything different, because that people are, she liked to say, oh, you think people are special. And the answer is no, from her point of view, they're not. And so it's easy to construct a chart to say that Lynn is right. So here is population growing. You notice over here, it's just growing in an unconstrained way. It kind of looks like uncontrolled exponential growth. It kind of looks like racing towards the edge of the Petri dish. You can find another one here. Here's global primary energy consumption, showing the same kind of pattern. Here is global per capita income, same kind of pattern. So the question is, you know, think about it. According to most demographers, in 2050, there'll be almost 10 billion people in the world. Is there any reason to think that we can avoid hitting the edge of the Petri dish? And I started on this really a few years ago when my daughter was born, and this question occurred to me, and also had conversations with Lynn. And so as a science journalist, I started talking to researchers who were concerned about this. And after a while, I realized their answers fell into two broad categories, each of which, at least in my mind, and many of theirs, was associated with one of these two guys. So the first answer to the question, you know, can we avoid hitting the edge of the Petri dish, is provided by this guy. And I asked a philosopher friend of mine what to call his school of thinking, and he said it's easy. He's a Schumpeterian technophiliac meliorist. And I said, that's not going into any book I write, so I can just call him a wizard. Now, Borlaug was born in the turn of the century. Here's his one-room schoolhouse, you know, very, very poor family. He was desperate to get off the farm, which was this very hard-scrabble affair. He didn't think he was very smart. He thought athletics was the way he was going to do it. Here he is. So he went to college, first member of his family to go to college, really to play athletics, discovered he wasn't good enough, and kind of accidentally ended up graduating with a degree in forestry just before the Great Depression. Couldn't get a job, so he hung around the college, and much to his surprise, ended up getting a PhD in plant pathology with a scientist named Elvin Stakeman, who is a prominent 20th century figure. We can talk about him later if you want to. Stakeman hornswoggled him into working on a project in Mexico, where he arrived in the mid-1940s. And it's important to know that Mexico then was not like Mexico now. It was poor in a way that very, very few places are poor now. Something like 2 out of 3 Mexicans at that time, at some point in the year, didn't have enough to eat. And worse, the main crop in Mexico is corn or maize, and the actual national production had been steadily marching down for 20 years. So even though they had planted more and more land and were moving into these incredibly marginal lands like this, the corn harvest between 1920 and 1940 went down by about 1/3. And so the place is really rapidly approaching a catastrophe, and there is this idea to send this small band of Americans, scientists there, to somehow fix Mexican maize agriculture. Now the weird thing is that Borlaug actually wasn't part of this. He was part of a even smaller contingent, which consisted entirely of himself, to try and deal with stem rust, which is a fungi that's one of the classic enemies of wheat. It's been around so long that the Romans actually had a god of stem rust that they would sacrifice animals to try to propitiate. You can imagine how effective that was. And so stem rust ravaged the small number of Mexican wheat farmers, and so the point was that he was supposed to try to do something about this. And this was basically, from top to bottom, a ridiculous idea. Borlaug didn't speak any Spanish. He'd never been outside the United States. He'd never done any plant breeding. He had very, very little experience with wheat. And more important, he's working in the mid-40s. He doesn't know what DNA is. Nobody does. I mean, it's not because he's stupid. It's just nobody knows, because Watson and Crick has it. He doesn't know what a gene is. And the wheat genome, as any kind of plant scientist to tell you, is much more complicated than the human genome, because, as Lynn would put it, wheat is way more interesting than people. You know, from her point of view, bacteria are like here, wheat's here, and then people are down here. And so it has, 5 times as many genes, 3 complete genomes in every cell. And even on top of that, just as icing, there's they thought somehow that American scientists had like these superpowers. So he went down there, had no tools, no laboratory, no buildings, no machine. He didn't even have fields, and somehow he's supposed to transform all this. And the incredible thing is, he basically succeeded. And he didn't know that what he was doing was impossible, so he was protected by ignorance, and he gathered together thousands and thousands and thousands of different varieties of wheat and randomly crossed all of them in the hopes of getting a hybrid wheat that would be resistant to stem rust in Mexican conditions. And amazingly, he succeeded, and he did this rust-resistant, super productive wheat that would grow almost anywhere. And so Rockefeller Foundation had basically totally failed using the same methods with maize, and so they're very happy to that this odd offshoot has succeeded. And so this is a promotional photograph from 1952 to give you some idea of how many resources he had. He actually didn't have this tractor or this truck. They borrowed them from neighbors, and they had to stand him up there and force him to smile. And the reason was he knew that his super productive wheat didn't work. And the reason was it took in so much fertilizer, it would grow up so rapidly that the stalks would become spindly and they would fall over and lodge. And have you guys, by the way, ever seen a stalk of wheat? Okay, because it's actually this is not a given in the United States anymore that people would know what a wheat looks like, what wheat looks like. And I've actually spoken to audiences in which I did not get a yes answer. Okay, so it's a grass, and there's wheat on the top, and it can fall over, and the wheat crimps, and nutrients can't get in, and the plant rots. And this is called lodging, and it was a huge issue. So he went back to the drawing board, and he found this bizarre dwarf Japanese rice that had been around for centuries and kept there as a kind of a curiosity. And you can see here that these two strains of wheat were planted in the same place at the same time. And this had a short, thick stalk, and so you could absorb all the fertilizer and not fall over. And the results of this were spectacular. And he more or less accidentally came up with what's called the package. And that's the hybrid seeds, high-intensity fertilizer, and irrigation. And the results of combining all these things together are really extraordinary. And so here's Mexican winter wheat yields according to official Mexican statistics. This is where the green revolution, as it's called, wheat comes in. And you see it basically triples wheat harvests. And it's not just in Mexico. This is US wheat yields, and the same methods and the same seeds are applied here. And this is when the United States, the Middle West especially, becomes an agricultural powerhouse. And then it moves over to Asia. This is Margaret Bourke-White, this famous photographer, and she was so struck by this that she actually took a bunch of pictures of wheat fields. And what you're seeing here is, right, this is a very poor-looking wheat field? Okay, good. And the reason that it's like this is not only do they not have any water, but the farmers are deliberately planting it sparsely in an attempt to prevent the spread of stem rust from plant to plant. So obviously something like this is not going to be very productive. When you can plant green revolution wheat, what happens, the same thing happens in the developing countries. And then the same methods move on to rice and in a different way to maize. And the results are actually extraordinary. And they're typically shown in charts like this that I don't think give you some idea, really much idea about what's going on. So here is sort of the world food supply, and it doesn't look like all that much. But then maybe I can help you here. This is what the USDA, just to take a thing, says is for moderately active men, moderately active women. So the midpoint is somewhere in here. And what this is telling you is that somewhere around here, everybody in the world, everybody in Asia, on average, had enough to eat. That the food supply is grown. There's enough for everyone, per capita food supply according to the FAO. And this is a huge hinge point in human history. As far back as we know, there's been famine. There's been no recorded society that has existed without it. And it was a constant presence in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America. And then sometime in the 80s or 90s, this happened. And for the first time, as far as we know in human history, famine that was just caused by agricultural shortfalls, not famine caused by war, just disappeared. And it really hasn't happened since then. And this has happened in the lifetime of many of the people in this room. It's something that should really be taught. Our world is profoundly different, and it has much to do with the Green Revolution. But the Green Revolution also had other impacts, not all of which were positive. One of the ones is that they grew so much food because they poured in vast amounts of fertilizer. And you can see fertilizer growth is extraordinary. Something like 40% of this fertilizer did not get taken up by plants. It either went up in the air, where it interfered with the ozone layer, not a good thing. It went down in lower bands of the atmosphere. It creates various forms of pollution. And then it goes into the ocean, and there very bad things happen. Nitrogen fertilizer in the ocean is still fertilizer. It causes these enormous blooms of algae and other aquatic plants. This is the Gulf of Mexico. These grow, they die, they fall to the bottom of the ocean. Bacteria on the bottom of the ocean consume them, and they have this frenzy of growth that sucks all the oxygen out of the water and creates these dead zones, enormous dead zones. The one in the Gulf of Mexico is typically about 7,000 square miles. The one in the Bay of Bengal was measured last year for the first time, and it was about 21,000 square miles. These huge areas in which essentially nothing can live. But even more important, I think, were the social consequences. And this is a Diego Rivera mural from 1931, sort of showing a sugar plantation, how it was in Mexico at the time. And so here you have the pale-skinned guy who owns it, not really doing anything, just lying and watching all these dark-skinned people working in terrible conditions. And then you have the soldiers, the federales, there making sure that the poor people don't rebel. So you have this tremendously oppressive social systems that are throughout the world. And so what happens in these kinds of systems when smallholders suddenly get Green Revolution techniques, Green Revolution seeds, why they can grow much more food, they can grow 3 or 4 times more food, their land becomes 3 or 4 times more valuable. And that means it is worth stealing. And that's exactly what happens. Often abetted by the government, massive numbers of people are pushed off the land, and this guy over here grabs it all, and so you have these enormous collapse of small farming, the creation of enormous industrial farms, and all those people end up in cities, many of them in terrible conditions, in vast conurbations like this one here, Mexico City. So the Green Revolution, sort of gives and takes away and has this manifold consequences. And the lesson that many draw from all this is the first part, right? That you apply science and technology, and that allows you to produce your way out of your dilemmas, and we'll deal with the social and environmental consequences later. Now, the second response here, vote, is different. And this guy is, more than anybody else, the progenitor of the modern environmental movement, which is the most important political ideology, I would argue the only enduring political ideology that's come out of the last century. And I asked the same philosopher, he called it this. I don't even know how to pronounce this, so I just call him a prophet, and hope that you guys are okay with that. He also started off in a poor family. When he was 11 days old, his father ran away with a wife of a local rich person, and a scandal was juicy enough to make the front page of the New York Times. The family ended up in a slum in a neighborhood in Brooklyn, and he got plucked out of this as a smart kid, and they have these schools in New York where smart poor kids can go to these special public schools. This was one of them, and he graduated, and he too was the first member of his family to graduate to go to college, and he too graduated right before the Depression with a degree in French literature. And it was about as useful as a degree in forestry, and so he turned to bird watching as an alternative career, which gives you some idea of how desperate he was. And he was very industrious. He made friends with these famous ornithologists at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and he ends up here. This is the Peru, and these are these islands off the coast of Peru. Peru has this thing called the Humboldt Current, which goes along it. It's full of nutrients. The nutrients attract huge numbers of fish, and then there's, on these islands are huge numbers of birds that eat the fish. And they've roosted there for millennia upon millennia, and they've had their nests there, and they've also excreted, and what as a result, over thousands of years, they create these vast humps of guano, of bird excrement, or I guess the technical term is poop. And here's people, and what turns out, this is the world's first high-intensity fertilizer. It becomes super important to the Peruvian government in the middle of the 19th century, and they bring in slaves from China who work in horrendous conditions, and they carve up these islands, and it's responsible for between 1/2 and 3/4 of the Peruvian government's revenue, selling off this fertilizer, because artificial fertilizer hadn't yet been invented. And this still is important to them in the 1930s, and the bird supply here, the number of birds, which are mostly these guanay cormorants, goes down, and they want to hire a bird expert, and no real ornithologist wants to go down and live in these places, and so what happens is they get William Vogt. And this is what the islands look like today. There's not a blade of grass, there's not a single plant anywhere on them. It smells like bus stop restroom, at best. And this was his laboratory. I forgot to mention, it often reaches 110 degrees there, and that the only other animals on there besides the cormorants are flies. Large numbers of flies, which I can attest bite a lot. And so he works in miserable conditions. Here's his poor wife, who he drags along here. These are bird nests, by the way. And these are not little people, these are the birds. I mean, this gives you some idea of what the conditions were like. And he realizes something there. He actually makes this breakthrough in science. He realizes that there are these currents. We now are much more famous now than then, called El Nino and La Nina, and that there's this oscillation now called ENSO. He is the guy who sort of brings this to the attention of the world. Of course, Peruvians had known this, and he realizes that there's this Humboldt current that goes along here. When the warm water comes in, the fish don't go along the coast of Peru because the water's too warm for them. Instead, they swim out here, and so the birds here can't fly far enough to get the food. And this sets a natural limit on how many birds you can have. This regularly recurring cycle means that there's a ceiling. There's a natural process here that goes on, and that means that he's supposed to, as he puts it, augment the increment of excrement. He's supposed to, by increasing the bird supply, and he realized he can't augment the increment of excrement. All you can do is try to make sure that this natural process works as best it can, and that human endeavors fit in with this. In modern terms, which is he's one of the people who popularized it, he says the islands have a carrying capacity. And I'm sure if any of you took Ecology 101 or took Ecology Environmental Science in high school, you've heard of the idea of carrying capacity. And he plucks this out of obscure parts of range management, where it's been championed by Aldo Leopold, who's not nearly as famous then as he is now, and writes this book here called The Road to Survival in 1948, which is the first modern We're All Going to Hell book. And this book, if you read Silent Spring, if you read The Limits to Growth or The Population Bomb or any of these environmental classics, all of their ideas stem from here. And the first and most important idea is that there's these limits. I recently heard them called, people like him called a limitarian, which I kind of like. I wish I'd thought of that and put it in the book. And you can see this again and again. And here you have, this is something, a common way of describing it. There's a certain, carrying capacity to the Earth, an ecological limit, and here's the number of Earths used by humanity. And you notice that it starts going across one Earth just about as the Green Revolution is kicking in. Then now the most sort of scientific way of talking about it is the planetary boundaries, and there's these ideas that there's certain limits that we can't surpass, and there's 9 particular ones of them. But all this idea stems from vote. And the idea is that we have too many people and we consume too much. And we're going to break Earth's ecosystems. And this too has some negative impacts. One of them is that in the 1970s and 1980s, there's these huge anti-population campaigns. And it's very, very difficult to describe in modern, to us today, what actually went on, because it was so terrifically awful. What happened was millions of people, mostly women, but also men, were forced to be sterilized. Many of whom, thousands of people died in these botched sterilization operations. There are tens of millions of forced abortions. You can imagine sort of the incentives are here. Here's a chart, thing from India in 1981. You earn 25 rupees by motivating for sterilization. In other words, workers in these government offices were paid money. The more money they got, from the more people they sterilized. And so there was things like, if you wanted to send your children to school, you had to be sterilized. If you wanted to have access to power, you had to be sterilized. If you wanted to be able to get certain kinds of government subsidies for your farm, you had to be sterilized. And so the results were absolutely horrific. In China, they had the one-child policy, kind of a different kind of thing, but it did lead to as many as 100 million forced abortions. And in some places, like the Philippines, this sort of stuff is still going on. The Duterte, the head of the Philippines, has just kind of reintroduced really heavy emphasis on forcing down population, and already there are many, many reports of human rights abuses. And the terrible thing is, it really wasn't all that effective. I mean, here is India's population growth. This right there is the center of this campaign. And so it caused enormous suffering, but it actually didn't do that much. Same thing here. Here's where the one-child policy begins. It continues right out here, just ended. And you can see not a moment where you say that there's a dramatic reduction starting from this. So you have enormous human consequences, and actually relatively little impact on population. So here you have two powerful but imperfect answers to the question, how are we going to make our way in the world of 10 billion? And so how are we going to feed everybody? That's the obvious first question. And to a person, most of the wizards would tell you, most of Borlaug's descendants, and literally Borlaug himself, would tell you the answer is GMOs, genetically modified plants. This is the International Rice Research Institute. This is the headquarters, the rice wing of the Green Revolution, started as a direct consequence of Borlaug's success by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation. In the early 1960s, they started breeding rice, and today something on the order of 80% of the rice that's grown in Asia comes from seeds originated here. And it's also the main staging ground for the C4 Rice Initiative, which is this 20-year, $100 million 16-lab, enormous plant science endeavor, and it's attempting to change the way that photosynthesis works in rice. And I can tell more about that if you want to. It's an absolutely fascinating thing that they are doing. But the thing I'd like to emphasize here is the scale at which it operates on. This is the testing grounds in Ciro in Australia, and what this is about is continuing the Borlaugian idea of these enormous industrial farms that are growing these hybrid seeds with massive chemical input. So this is an attempt to step on the gas and produce more food in the way that we've already been doing it. Now the prophets' answer to the question of what we're going to do is quite different, because they argue that the environmental consequences they talk about are getting just mount, and they're going to become more and more severe, and so we have to incorporate that into, we can't deal with them later, we have to put them up front and center. And a typical answer is here. This is a farmer in northwest Illinois who I've been visiting for the past few years, Lloyd here, and he has a farm. It's very difficult to take a picture of, but this might give you some idea. He has more than 1,000 different crop varieties grown in kind of polyculture. And what he's doing essentially is mimicking a natural system. He's creating a kind of an ecosystem of crop varieties with dozens and dozens of crops being harvested and grown at any one time. It's a huge information management problem. It's a highly technological enterprise, just like the others, just quite different. So he has, for winter production, he has 8 solar-powered greenhouses, 4 indoor sprouting centers. The day I was there, he was testing out drones to monitor his crops. I spent about an hour out there trying to take a picture of the drone. I'm not a very good photographer, so this is actually a fake picture. This is an advertisement. But that's what it looked like, okay? So it's a fake picture. I'm trying to give you some idea. Anyway, so this is an exotic cosmopolitan object, just as strange, in a certain way, as the huge industrial farms that we were talking about, but it's enormously different in every way. And so the best way I can show it is, here's Lloyd here, and here's his neighbor, Henry, who is a conventional industrial farmer, quite successful, and the two places might be on different planets. So Henry over here, he has 1,300 acres. He's got 2 crops, which are corn and soy, which are both GMOs. He estimated that these yield 7 to 8 million kilograms. Just tons and tons of high-intensity chemicals of all sorts that he bathes the entire. And the whole thing is done with just him and his son, 2 guys with high school degrees, and a couple $1 million worth of equipment. Really amazing equipment. And then here's the big thing, the number of subsidies and programs and projects and so forth to aid farmers like him from the state, from the locality, from the county, from the federal government is just enormous. I talked to him and I just was writing in my notebook. Now, here is Lloyd's farm. And he has about 1,000 acres. He has no GMOs, not because he's particularly opposed to them, but because they don't make, he grows all these different crops and they don't have GMOs for most of them. He gets on the smaller thing almost as much, but it's difficult to compare them because there's such different crops, and also they have lots of water in them. So if you just do it on a straight weight basis, he grows more, but I don't know if that's really an appropriate comparison. And in fact, this is a problem that plagues almost every effort to compare organic and conventional agriculture, is that they're basically incommensurable. Very, very little chemical input, and here's another big thing, he has 11 full-time employees, 2 with master's degrees and 30-plus part-time employees. This is a huge community enterprise, and he's never gotten a dime. He basically keeps this going because he's super, super stubborn. And so these people might as well be operating in different planets. They both produce huge amounts of food, but the fundamental difference between them is their environmental consequences and the social consequences. This one is great if you particularly imagine that what we want to do is, people don't want to be on farms and they want to be in cities and maximize individual liberty. This one is great if you imagine people do want to be in these smaller rural communities, do want to have a connection to the land, do feel more democratic and more in charge of their lives. And so the difference between these, which is often described in the sort of the wizard's vision and the prophet's vision, which is often described in pragmatic terms, this produces more calories or this is better for the environment, it's also got a major sort of vision about how you want to live and what you think is good. And one of the problems in discussing many environmental issues is that these kind of moral ideas about the human place in nature, the human place in community, are embedded in them in ways that we find very difficult to talk about. And so this fight between the wizards and prophets goes on. I gave a talk actually on this at MIT, and afterwards, I was grabbed by a bunch of people, and there's a considerable argument about whether Spock or Kirk was the wizard or the prophet. And the people rapidly exhausted my knowledge of Star Trek and went into much more detail than I would really want. So I'm hoping that you guys won't do that, because that was a tough thing to get out of. So I'm just putting this for comic relief. It's not actually a considered critique, okay? But these kinds of disputes you see again and again. This is Beaumont, Texas. This is really where the U.S. fossil fuel industry began. A year before this was a meadow, and the Spindletop oil field was discovered here. And in less than a year, this went up, and the ocean of fossil fuels that is since then has characterized the United States really begins here. There have been earlier stuff in Pennsylvania, but this is where it really starts. But I should want to point out that that's the wizard's way. The prophet's way has been all there at the same time. This beginning with this guy, Mouchot, who starts in the 1860s, and what he gets is these things here have mirrors, they focus on water, they drive steam engines, and here he is printing books in the Jardin des Tuileries in Paris in 1882. In the US, the major spokesman is a guy named John Erickson, a real visionary, famous inventor, and what he has is this idea that every neighborhood, every house, every building is going to have one of these, and it's going to be this decentralized, supple, resilient feed where people are passing, power back and forth with their neighbors. It's a completely democratized system, as opposed to the wizard system, which involves huge centralized, state-controlled and state-regulated power plants that, with these massive installations that are then fed across to individuals. And it is, again, a preference for how you want things to be. Now, the wizards and prophets here, the prophets have been pretty much shut down by the fact that this is so much cheaper than and more reliable than solar power ever was. But now comes the specter of climate change, and suddenly this battle goes up again. This is a picture of my friend Peter Menzel's backyard in California during the fires. These are, of course, linked to, in a complicated way, to climate change. By the way, this is his perhaps incautious wife, Faith, standing there, and that fire is as close as it looks. So the question is, are we going to see more and more of this stuff? And what are we going to do? What do the wizards say? What do the prophets say? Well, the wizards want to have, again, the same thing as before. Step on the gas, produce more power, but do it in a decarbonized way. So you have giant dams, you have giant concentrated solar plants, you have giant wind farms like the one that was going to be off of Massachusetts. These guys are 640 feet tall. It's a really kind of shocking when you see them. And then especially next generation nuclear plants, which are mostly only being built in China and perhaps a few places in other parts of Asia. Now, the prophets have an entirely different view, which stems directly from John Erickson. And here you see it exemplified. This is the first fully solar neighborhood in the Southeast. It's in New Orleans. I think Brad Pitt paid for some of this. And then you have rooftop wind. And then ultimately the vision is something here. This is the power flowers, an experimental technique being developed by these Dutch firm. And you have these things which somehow rotate like trees, and they vibrate and generate power in ways that didn't make any sense to me when I read it. But you get the idea. And the idea is that the power, instead of being in these giant facilities, is embedded in the landscape. And that has, from their point of view, many, many fewer costs. It's also under much more local control, and so forth. So you have these completely diverging views. So at this point, if Lynn was in the audience, she was sitting in the back, you'd hear this noise, and that would be her eyes rolling around in her socket, because all of this, from her point of view, would be that what this discussion is completely futile. It's completely stupid, because that's not what people do. I remember one time I was walking on the street, and I was upset because our Congress had not done something about some climate change or some other environmental issue, and she looked at me and said, well, duh. You know, do the protozoa, when they're seeing the edge of the petri dish coming, do they say, oh, we better stop? No, they just march right onto the edge, and that's what living things do, and so just pull up your socks, was her point of view. So, as I said, she died a few years ago, and I was never able to sit down and try and think about a cogent response to this, about whether, all this part about the wizards and prophets is a distinction that doesn't make a difference. And so if she were alive, I think this is what I would try to say to her. This is a political map of the world in 1800. And as you can see, it's quite different from what we have today, but it's different in other ways that are not really easily visible on this map. And one of the things is, in this world, slavery is a legal and accepted part of society, everywhere. I'm not sure that there's a society in which it's not, and that's the way it's been since the beginning of recorded history. The earliest legal code that we know of, which is the Code of Hammurabi, if you read it, it's all about slavery. It's all about when you can buy and sell people and what you're allowed to do to punish those people that you own. I mean, it's a set of regulations for slavery, and that's the case with every society that we know. And the institution differs from one place to another, but at this time, according to the historian Adam Hochschild, something like 2 out of 3 people on the planet are unfree laborers. It's a foundational human institution. Its importance cannot be overstressed. And this here suddenly changes in the 19th century. And a thing that has characterized human society in the deepest way since its beginning becomes illegal and not accepted anywhere today. The International Labor Organization will certainly tell you that there's slaves that exist. There's about 25 million of them. But the difference between what is going on now and what is going on in this world is just enormous. The same thing is true for women. If you believe archaeologists and anthropologists, there is no society that we know since the beginning of complex society in which women have not been subjected to an inferior status at the whim of men. There's no place in the world here where, except for a very, very few super elite women, are allowed to own property, are allowed to dump a husband that is cruel or abusive, that are allowed to participate in the public sphere, that are allowed to be educated. You can go on and on and on. The number of things they can't do. It's easier to list the number of things that women are allowed to do than the ones that they can't do, because the list is so much shorter. And then this changes profoundly and deeply. Obviously, all of these changes are incomplete, as the Me Too movement has really eloquently shown recently. But the conditions for women are just extraordinarily different. And this is, again, a foundation. The subjection of women was as fundamental to human society as, I don't know, as gravitation is to the orbits of the planets. This society also, world here in 1800, was extraordinarily violent. And violent in top to bottom, in terms of domestic violence, in terms of local violence, in terms of state violence, and in terms of war. Every possible index you could see, it was vastly higher than it is today. And it's been making this slow and unsteady process down for the last few hundred years, possibly for the last millennia or so. We don't really know. One of the things that I learned in writing this book that really struck me is that in the 16th century, a greater percentage of the people in Germany, of just the people in Germany, were killed than they were in the 20th century, despite the fact that Germany, for a decade in the 20th century, was run by genocidal madmen who went around and killed 1/10 of the population systematically, slaughtering them. So it was actually better for you to be a random German, even possibly including all the Jews and the Gypsies and so forth, in the 20th century than it was in the 17th century, which gives you some idea, not how good it was in the 20th century, but how dreadful it was earlier on. And so the only argument I could really make to Lynn about our capacity to be special, as she put it, is that we have, in the past, in recent past, really transformed our society. And I guess it would just be incredibly disappointing if we failed to make the changes necessary to survive in the coming one. in the coming century. And that's really what I came to talk about. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, or at least try to. Thank you. Well, I think Lynn would say, yeah, we've known about it for 60 years. A lot of difference it's made. Yeah. So she would take that as proof of her point.
I mean, and similarly, you know, slavery is outlawed, but poverty is criminalized. And you know, I think they're making progress about these things. But I mean, I still think there's a long way to go. Freedom is a real thing rather than an ideal. But do I have a question?
That seems like we're sort of straying into statement territory, I think. And I'm happy to exchange statements, but maybe can I talk to you afterwards? And is there an actual question? If not, we can just run off and have you know, extra time. But well, I don't think I actually. I'm going to here object to the question because I'm trying to tell you what's going on. I think this is what's going on, and I studied this. The instant I start talking about what I think, I'm just some guy in a coffee shop, right? You know, I like this, and so I'd really like to focus on this and give people the tools to make it right. And there's a second reason is that the immediate time that you start saying, well, I actually think this is right, it casts suspicion on everything you went before. And so far, you guys are in a trance of thinking I'm in a trance of objectivity, which I'm trying to be.
So, I guess to me, it seems like there might be a third category, and I'm curious your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of something that, as maybe someone more on the prophet, and kind of been dismayed to see emerging. There's this kind of highly corporatized, but like crowd-based stuff. A lot of it's digital, but then you look at things like Uber, where you've got, you know, the Leviathan kind of, you know, just deciding what the rules are, but then there's these individual kind of, you know, landscape-based people running their individual cars, and it kind of mimics the prophet's picture, but has some wizard elements to it. I'm curious if, you know, you could, I don't know, play with that idea a little bit, maybe in the context of.
Well, it could be that could be hopeful in the sense that you would, you know, you could see that as taking the best of both, or you could, as I kind of think many prophets do, see it as you know, kind of greenwashing, or you know, that kind of thing, and just the same old, and thus you'll see like that concentrated solar plant that I showed you up there has been vigorously fought by local environmental groups as the introduction of Leviathan, as you put it, into, you know, and this is not, solar power is a wonderful thing, renewables are a wonderful thing, this is not how it should be done, because it's just going to reproduce the same social issues that are done with nuclear power plants or whatever the large thing is. And so they would see Uber, I think, as, you know, taking something that could be great, which would be, you know, a form of decentralized public transportation, and instead of making taxi drivers' lives better and everybody else's lives better, what it does is, you know, extract wealth from communities for people in San Francisco. So that would be the counterattack, I think. Yes, lots and lots of people are, but you know, really those things are almost all, at least all the ones I've seen, are exercises in moralistic pronunciamentos about you know, this is how other people should live, and it's very, very difficult to sort of shake your biases. And there's a striking thing that people from the global north tend to have much lower numbers than people from the global south. And when I brought this up with some people in India, they said, yeah, that's because we're the ones that are going to be slaughtered, you know, you know, under these projections. It's also, another problem is, all right, suppose we identify and we actually agree that population X is the best. How do we get there? And the methods that have been used in the past have been abhorrent and ineffective. And the only ways that have really been effective that we really know of are basically in one way or another, in multiple ways, empowering women, which is a total win-win in social policy. Not only is it the right thing to do, but it also has had enormous impact economically and demographically and socially. And there's a pretty strong correlation between societies that have equal opportunities for women. It's not perfect, but pretty strong, and societies with lower birth rates.
You talked about the energy industry and the food industry, and another industry where you see this division is transportation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think about you've got Elon Musk working on hyperloops, and you have other people working on buses. And,
yeah.
And the same is true for aviation.
Right.
In aviation policy, you see some people working on biofuels and electric planes that don't really have a lot of realism, and then other people are thinking about lifestyle change and
right.
other things that change how we get around. Have you, along with the energy and the food, have you been focused at all on transportation?
Not so much transportation, because there's only so much you can do in one book, but I do spend a lot of time on water. And I think that, a regret that I have is, because you can't talk about everything, is that water, I think, is fresh water is the most urgent short-term environmental issue that we face. There's just really a ridiculously small amount of available fresh water in the world, and there's lots and lots, and we've been unbelievably negligent about the way it's used in almost every nation in the world. And typically there's a split between the sort of wizards and prophets there. There's water short places, there's typically, like California, there's a huge industry that wants to have giant desalination plants and these major, Governor Brown is pushing through this huge thing to take the Sacramento River, these tunnels and, to the south. And then people like the Pacific Institute who argue that what's going on is that the water is, used in a criminally inefficient way, and we shouldn't be, convulsing ecosystems and having massive capital expenditures so that we can have golf courses in Palm Springs and other, sort of things like that. And so in water, the water world is called the hard path and the soft path. And so there's an area where I do talk about this. And so it's not a direct answer to your question, but at least allows me a chance to say that there's something else I talk about.
I want to shift gears a little bit. I have a writing question.
Uh-huh.
So you're obviously very good at communicating scientific and technical history to diverse audiences. I was just wondering if that changes the way you research and look into what obviously took a lot of time to uncover about the history of this topic. How does it affect who you talk to, what sources you use, and kind of hear about that?
It doesn't affect so much who I talk to, although in the sense that I do try to talk to a range of people. It's pretty easy to realize that you're talking to only a certain type of person. So I think people really do have different perspectives and so forth. And I'll give you, actually, let me break it. There's how this kind of question, who you talk to, and then how you write. And so who you talk to, when you talk to a wide range of people, you always benefit. So, one of the most productive trips I had in terms of this book was my second trip to West Africa, where there's a tremendous number of really smart people in universities and in labs in West Africa who had very, very good ideas and told me a tremendous amount, and of course had a very different perspective on things. And one of them made the incredibly cogent point that northern agriculture, like we have, is fixated on cereals. But in fact, there are many, many more productive crops, tubers and trees in particular, that both are more productive and have, there's a considerable hope that they would have less environmental impact for a variety of reasons. Trees, obviously, are great for erosion questions. And and when I said, well, people won't eat, whatever, she said, think about it, about half your agriculture, more or less, is going to things like high fructose corn syrup and all these industrial products. There's no particular reason they can't be grown with cassava or even apples or nuts or anything. There's a tremendous number of these chemicals that much of what our agriculture is going for, that can be grown with these other crops that are vastly more productive and would have smaller environmental inputs. And I have been talking to people in the United States and in Europe to agriculture for 15 years. I'd never heard that. And I sort of thought, that's really weird. I looked up, she was right. She's totally right. And then I talked to people from Brazil, and they said, oh, yeah, we tell this to Americans. They never listen. But it's true, And so so it's important to talk to diverse people, and I think that. And so some of the parts that people told me about this book are most surprising are, in fact, for people over here, are like, common knowledge. It's just that we don't want to listen. The second thing that you try to do is to remember that your reader today, especially, can be doing a lot of other things other than reading your book. And so I try to remember I can't waste their time. And I should try at the very hardest to be at least a little bit amusing. And think of the poor bastard who has to read this. And it's amazing the number of people who are writers, who never think about some poor tuna who's coming home. They're tired, they could always go on Facebook. So you have some obligation to make them feel like they're not, it's not homework.
I'm curious why you chose this sort of binary model for that all of human effort.
Well, not all of human effort.
Not all of human effort, but kind of in this.
Well, it kind of chose me.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm curious what you found that added to your analysis and that.
Well, okay, why I did this. Really, this book started, one point was this conversation with Lynn that I mentioned. Another point was when my daughter was born. If you're a guy, there's this whole industry that tries to convince you that you have something to do with the birth. So they make you go to these classes, and people are, at least in my experience, my children, there's all these people in the hospital, while you're like breathing and doing all this stuff and counting. They say, oh, it's so good you're here. You're playing an essential role. It's sort of like you're getting a medal for participation, I guess. And so anyway, then they throw you out. So the people who actually did something, the mother and the baby, can get some rest, and so there it is, 3 o'clock in the morning. It's always 3 o'clock in the morning for some reason. I'm standing there, and it suddenly pops into my head that when Amelia, that's my daughter, is my age, then there's, demographers believe there's going to be almost 10 billion people in the world. And I thought, boy, how is that going to work? And I knew this, of course, but then, somehow it really hit me. I don't know what, maybe I had more skin in the game, I don't know. And so I just started talking to people without any idea I was going to write about it. I'm a science journalist, and I would talk to people, and I'd say, if I hit it off, I'd say, my daughter's going to be, and all these people are going to be affluent because the world's getting more affluent. What are we going to do? And I realized that they were giving me two different kinds of answers, depending on who I talked to. And also these two names kept coming up. And they'd say, oh, yeah, basically we want to do for water what Borlaug did for food. You'd hear that kind of thing. Or we need to have a second green revolution. We need to have another Borlaug, Or on the other side, they would say, well, a lot of these ideas goes down to limits, and that all comes down to that guy. You've never heard of him. His name's Vogt, that kind of thing. And so I kept hearing this, and then I discovered the thing that makes freelance writers happy, which is that there's some connection between them, which is that they got their ideas in the exact same place at the exact same time. And then I started, thinking, oh, that might be a framework. And the basic thing about models, this is sort of a crude model, is that all of them are wrong, but some of them are useful. And I think this is a useful way of looking at these issues that helps you think about what's important in them. I wish I could have answered your question more quickly, but that was... Yeah.
Without kind of burning into the Russian thing that you mentioned, like really truly kind of stay true to both sides of life.
Yeah, I think there's lots. It's not like a physical law. The gravitation says you can't do things. There's nothing. It's just that it's a kind of a frame of mind. And so some obvious ones are. I've been struck by when you look at Lloyd's farms, and there's lots of farms like that around the world. How very, very little research in places like UC Davis has gone into helping these kinds of people, even just on the level of helping them mechanize a little bit. It's incredibly small amount of work has gone into thinking about how these farms work and helping the farmers. For example, there's a farm that's like this. It's not very far from me where I live in Amherst. And I went over to visit Jeremy one day, and he was really excited. Big farms, they can, if they can't grow up Roundup ready crops, they need to deal with weeds, which are a big problem. And so they have these huge machines that cost $1 zillion that have these gas jets that burn the weeds. And they cost, $250,000, something just absurd. And they're monsters. Well, somebody for the first time had made one that was for a small farm that cost $5,000. And he was just like a kid in a candy shop, he's like, wow, because, he's been spending all his time lifting up weeds. They're just a drag. And so that is an example of where you would think that wizards and prophets could collaborate, but then I went to visit UC Davis, and they said, oh, yeah, I guess that would be a good idea. It's like that. Or the trees and tubers kind of thing. There's an example where you could maybe meet in the middle, because there's been no serious efforts to really breed cassavas for productivity, or they have low nutrition, so that, to make them more nutritious or anything like that. There's just been a few efforts, and because the good thing is, because there's been no effort, that you should be able to make, on the good side of diminishing returns, you should be able to make some big impacts right away. Another one is with the fight over nuclear power. What's astonishing to me is that people have been fighting over nuclear power for 50 years. And one side keeps saying, next generation nukes. The other says, no nukes. What if you never see them say, what if you thought of nuclear power as a bridge fuel? To get us over the hump so that we could get renewables. If we thought, we're going to have nukes for 30 years, and they're going to be small scale, little ones, there was minimal damage, and it was talked about in that way. I don't know if anti-nuke people would hate it or not, or what, but they don't even try. And when I tried to talk to nuclear engineers, they said, well, why would we do that? It's inefficient. And these things that's the way to do it. And I say, well, yeah, but it's like a compromise. And they look at you like, what's that word? So there's a human tendency there, I guess, as opposed to something really profound and real. Well, thanks, guys.